What's up, gunfighters? What are we going to talk about today? How about threat weapons? Famfire. That's what we're going to talk about today. Threat weapons here on Gunfighter Life, where we talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, use of force, the right way, with Almighty God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. I'll do a brief bio. First and foremost, a Christian. That's number one in everything that I do. God is number one. And I choose to acknowledge that, and everything in this podcast is no different. Marine Corps combat veteran, law enforcement, special assignments, and regular patrol. State rifle and pistol champion a few times over. Private contractor. Commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters. That's probably enough for now. It's late, guys. Had a lot of big winter storm rolling in here. It's supposed to be below zero in a day or two, so I had a lot of stuff to get done. It's pretty late. Getting on midnight, and I did not get a podcast recorded earlier. So, as they say, the show must go on. Enough of a bio. Let's get into threat weapons. I'm about to tell you what weapon you're going to face. Are you ready? Deep breath. I don't know. I don't know because I don't see the future, right? I don't see the future. I'm not a false prophet. There are pretty stiff penalties in the Bible for being a false prophet, and I don't pretend to be one. But if we look at data and use the logic and reason that God gave us, we can extrapolate some things. And I tried looking up some hard data, stuff like the DOJ, and they'll read into this whatever you want, but they have data on like how many assault weapons were used or how many handguns were used, but that doesn't really help. Assault weapon, are we talking a Steyr AUG? Probably not. Are we talking an Ar-15? What's the ratio to Ar-15 to AK? It couldn't find any good data on that. Here's the thing about threat weapons. You should be able to run most common weapons platforms. I don't care if you're an AR guy. You should be able to pick up and run an AK-47. You should be able to load, unload, clear a malfunction, and accurately use an AK-47. AK-47 is commonly seen in this country as a bad guy's gun, but that's an AK-47 is not malum and say it's not evil by nature. It's just a hunk of metal. Likewise, if you're an AK guy, you should be able to pick up and run an AR-15. You should be able to load it, unload it, clear many different malfunctions because an AR gets a lot of different kinds of malfunctions. Failure to fire, double feed, triple feed, bolt override. Can be a soup sandwich inside that upper receiver sometimes. But you should be able to clear those malfunctions. You should be able to run it with iron sights. You should be able to run it with a red dot. You should be able to run it with an LPVO. Why? Because they're common weapons, which means they're probably going to be common threat weapons. If you have to pick one up, whether it's to clear it or to use it, you should know. There was an old t-shirt, it's probably still around, for the jarheads, for the Marines, and it would say, "One mind, any weapon," and it might have like an AR, it might have a K-bar, might have a bayonet. But the point stands, one mind, any weapon. What makes a Marine so effective is not the kit, it's not his body armor, it's not his helmet, it's not his night vision, it's not his M16, it's not his K-bar. It's the fact that he's a warrior, and he has a warrior spirit and a warrior ethos, and he is trained to make the grass grow. And you'll get that reference if you're a Marine or know about Marine jargon. But that's what makes a Marine. Marines oftentimes have the worst of equipment as far as the armed forces go, but they're known for being the most formidable fighters. Because weapons are important, but they're not most important. You could have the fanciest rifle in the world, but if you're too afraid to pull the trigger, you could have the slickest, coolest Daniel Defense AR with the best optic, but if you're not willing to pull the trigger, if you're not trained and able to execute a good shot, you're just a weapons dump for a guy that is, for a man that is a warrior. You get mad at that, but the fact you dumped a bunch of money on something doesn't make you capable, right? The fact that I go out and buy a top of the line Fender Stratocaster, and I don't know almost nothing about guitars, guys. Forgive me if this is a bad analogy, but I go out and dump money on a brand new Fender Stratocaster and a brand new amp and the exact same setup that whomever the greatest rock star of our time has. Doesn't mean I can go on stage and play it, right? Just because you have a really nice gun doesn't make you a gunfighter. Any more than if you gave me Billy Joel's piano, I could play Piano Man, right? If you put a gun to my head and gave me a sheet of music in front of a piano and said, play this music, I'd do a gun takeaway and shoot you with that gun because I don't know how to play piano. And that's how I'm wired. I'm a warrior. It kind of illustrates the point. Whatever the weapon is, you should see yourself as the ultimate weapon. Those things are just tools to bring about an end. Hopefully to change somebody's bad behavior. With that kind of philosophy out of the way, again, you should know how to run common weapons. I don't care which side you are. I don't care if you're on Team AR or Team AK. You should be able to do basic things with both. Clear a take the weapon off safe. Put the weapon on safe. Clear a malfunction. Load the weapon. Unload the weapon. Get a fair degree. Now, it's not your weapon, so it's probably not going to be zeroed to you, but you should be able to bring out a decent-sized group with that weapon, whichever one it is. And I'd say that extends to most common weapons. Now, I was a cop on the street for quite a while. I worked some of the nastiest streets in Los Angeles, which by that measure, maybe some of the nastiest streets in the country. I wouldn't say the world. Some pretty nasty places in some third world countries, as I know from fighting a war. But some pretty nasty places in this country, and I've seen quite a few guns. And again, I don't have hard data on this, but you should know how, even if you don't like Glocks, even if you think Glocks have the ergonomics of a 2x4, a trigger like a stapler, and the sights of a Nerf gun. Right, you should still be able to get one and run it. I still have a factory Glock 17, and I would often in the past take it and go to training classes, especially if I was the guy in charge of the unit, and run a just basic Glock 17, because I wanted them to see that I could shoot that gun, and I wasn't shooting good because I had a several $1,000 STI, which I do and is my preferred duty weapon. But I wanted them to see that I could run a Glock, because a lot of them ran a Glock, and I didn't want them to think that I shot really good because I was shooting an STI. Could I shoot better with an STI? Yeah, for sure. It's a better gun. But I can shoot good with a Glock, and you should be able to shoot good with a Glock, even if you're not a Glock guy. You might not shoot it as good as your HKVP9 or as good as your, 1911 if you're a 1911 guy. I get it, but you should be able to shoot it well. The fundamentals of handgun marksmanship, pistol craft, it's pretty transferable. There are some things that are different. 1911 guy, you might try and sweep to safety and realize it doesn't have one, but you'll still be able to run that gun pretty good. You get the idea. Even if you're not a Glock guy, it's one of the most common handguns. By far, it's a giant Glocks as a conglomerate or a giant chunk of the handgun market. Ergo, they're a pretty big threat weapon. There's a good chance if you're getting in a wrong side of a handgun fight, you got handgun bullets coming back at you, there's a good chance they're coming from a Glock. Just because Glocks are so ubiquitous, right? So you should know how to run a Glock. If you prefer a gun with a manual safety, that's fine, but you should be comfortable running a gun without one. And on the flip side, if you only ever shoot Glocks and you think Glocks are the best thing since sliced bread and Glocks because everybody knows Glock and just Glock and I love Glock and I've got a Glock sticker on my car, you should still know how to run a 1911 because you might have to one day or you might have to clear it. Trying to pull the slide back and you don't know to take the safety off because the slide won't move back without the safety being disengaged, you're going to have a problem. You're going to be in a very stressful situation at that point probably anyway if you had to take somebody's gun from them or recover a gun, and you probably don't want to be fighting with it and frustrated and stressed out having a giant adrenaline dump because you just either had to shoot somebody or you got shot or whatever the case was. That's not the time to be trying to figure that out. You get the idea. Even if you're a Glock guy, you should know how to manipulate, clear a malfunction, take the weapon on and off safe, load, unload, and shoot a 1911. Because 1911s and guns like them that are similar with a frame-mounted thumb safety are pretty common. You can run a 1911 style gun. You can run a Glock style gun, which there's a lot of Glock clones out there. You can run the vast majority of handguns. You might run into some funky Polish Radom P64, sure, and you can't train for every single gun, but the vast majority of guns, if you can run those two platforms, I'd throw in there Beretta and Beretta clones because they have a different kind of safety, and they're double single. That's another giant chunk of the handgun market. Also, the real cheap guns, the Ghetto Glocks, right? Because they're pretty common on the street. I don't have hard numbers, but High Points, Jennings, Ravens, those kind of handguns. And if you can run a Glock in a 1911, you can figure out how to run one of those. They're just a little bit more crude, but loading, unloading, clearing malfunctions, which are probably, well, High Points are actually pretty reliable. They have worse ergonomics than a Glock, which is saying something. But they actually tend to be fairly reliable. They're just not very practical. But they're pretty common on the street. Also a revolver. If you're just a AR-15 and a Glock guy, dyed in the wool, you got a half a dozen Glocks and a half a dozen ARs, and revolvers hold no interest to you at all. I'm not saying you should go out and buy one, but next time you're at the range or you know a buddy that has one, get familiar with it. Do some familiarization fire. We talked about fam fire. You should probably know how to run a revolver. You might think that's super simple if you've ever run a revolver. Somebody that doesn't know, how do they know how to open the cylinder? There was a time when you didn't know how to open a revolver cylinder. Not everybody grew up in gun culture, right? People come to this later in life, and you and I didn't pop out of our mama's womb knowing how to open a revolver cylinder. I would say knowing how to run a revolver, both a double and a single action. And talk about not knowing, it's not very intuitive. If you hand somebody a single action revolver that's never messed with one, figuring out how to unload a single action revolver, that can be quite the comical event. Just handing somebody a single action revolver that's unloaded and safe, and having them try and figure out how to load it, right? Because you got a loading gate, which is totally alien to most designs. You've got a rod to push out empty cases. A lot of the designs, you have to have a partially cocked notch on the gun to spin the cylinder. It's not intuitive at all. There's a time when you and I didn't know that. If you're one of the ones that know it and are giggling to yourself, somebody had to show you, right? You didn't just, again, pop out of your mom's womb knowing how to know that. And those kind of guns are common, especially in the .22 format, and there's a lot of those. So I'd say as far as threat weapons and familiarization, you should, at first get comfortable with the guns that you have and learn how to run the guns that you have. But I think there's a place for a gunfighter, this is gunfighter life after all, to familiarization fire and get, even if you're not going to switch over to it, even if you have no desire to run an AK. I would throw into that an SKS. SKSs are all over the place, right? If you've only ever run a rifle with a detachable box magazine and you run into something that takes stripper clips, yes, clips are a thing. It is sometimes the correct term, and it's the correct term for an M1 Garand, and it's the correct term for an SKS. If you run into that kind of weapon, a Garand or an SKS, you should know how to clear those too. If you hand somebody in this new gun culture version 2.0, unless they've, probably people that play video games, I have no idea how people get into guns nowadays. And I don't say that facetiously. I'm sure there's some video game with an M1 Garand, and you see how the safety comes off. But if you handed somebody that didn't play video games and had only ever handled an AR-15 or something like it, and told them to put the safety on an M1 Garand, they might have some trouble because it's not anywhere near, it doesn't look anything like the safety on an AR-15. You get what I'm saying? Common weapons platforms, and probably the Garand is not common anymore, but there's a time when it was. The SKS is still very common. Heck, add to that Mosin and Gantz. Some people have never run a bolt gun. probably, if you're into guns, you probably know somebody that has a Mosin Nagant. And that somebody that has a Mosin Nagant probably has one that they'll let you shoot, right? It probably has one they'll let you shoot. Learning how to run that, learning where the safety is on a Mosin Nagant. Some people don't even know. They never even use it. They just run the bolt. There's a safety on a Mosin Nagant. Imagine you pick one of those up and you have to use it and you didn't know it had a safety on it. And you keep running the bolt, dumping rounds in the ground, and the gun won't go off and you don't know why. I would say the Mosin Nagant, super common. SKS is super common. AK pattern and all of its clones, very common. Ar-15s and its clones. Doesn't really matter if it's as far as you, I mean, it matters as far from a working standpoint, but as far as you doing the things we talked about, making it safe, loading, unloading, doesn't matter whether it's a piston gun or a direct impingement gun or if it's a Daniel Defense or a Palmetto State Armory, right? That's one of the great things about the ARs. They're pretty standard across the board. And you could throw into that mix the scars and all of those things. They operate not internally, but as far as the end user goes, as far as you knowing how to make one work and not work, they're pretty similar. And a lot of modern guns are like that AR pattern. And as far as handguns go, most of today's, you're probably not running up to like a C96 broom handle Mauser, right? You're probably not going to encounter one of those on the streets. Probably happened at some point, but it's not likely, and you can't plan for everything. But common guns, like a Glock, like a High Point, like a Jennings, 1911s and clones of 1911s, and there are a ton. Berettas and clones thereof, like the Taurus clones, there's quite a few of those. The double single action guns, how do you decock it, right? If you've never run it, if you never even shot a handgun with a hammer, which I gotta imagine a lot of the new shooters today haven't, you know, how do you decock a gun? How do you decock a gun with a hammer that has a decocker? Would they even know to look for a decocker if you've never run a hammer-fired gun? That's like a double single style gun. That's the things I'm talking about. Common platforms. And the good news is a lot of this will be fun. It'll be fun if you're unless you're just like only ever want to shoot an AR. But most people like shooting different stuff. It's probably fun if you get a chance to shoot an AK if you're an AR guy. And it might spoil you if you're a Glock guy and you shoot a 1911. You look on paper and you're like, well, this thing's old and antiquated and it's heavy, and why would anybody choose one of these? And then you shoot it and you're like, oh, that's why. Suddenly that Glock's not so perfect anymore. But anyway, I digress. You get a chance to shoot a 1911. If you're a Glock guy, go shoot the 1911. You're a 1911 guy and you get a chance to shoot a Glock and run a Glock, do it. So you know how to do it, even if you have no desire to switch to either other platform. So I don't know what the threat weapon's going to be. I know what common platforms are, and I know that cheaper guns often show up in bad guys' hands because it just seems to be the nature of it. Probably not running up against the bad guys from Die Hard with like MP5 full auto submachine guns. Probably not running into that. I mean, it's possible, but it's not likely. Probably not running into guys with Steyr AUGs. Unless you ever run in with the steampunk mafia, you're probably not running into guys with broom handle Mausers and semi-auto Webley revolvers. Yes, there is a semi-auto revolver. I know that sounds like not a thing, but it absolutely was a thing with their Webley revolvers. Kind of cool. You're probably not running into one of those, so you probably don't need to know how to use it. As cool as they are, if you want to shoot one and you get a chance, do it. But for threat weapons, you're probably not running into Thompson submachine guns, right? That's not the 1920s anymore. Probably not running into a Colt Monitor or a Browning BAR. Your common weapons, and especially common cheap weapons, you should know how to run them, even if it's not your main go-to thing. Anyway, that's something to think about. I think I've hammered that point home. And this isn't where you should stop, but somewhere you should look wherever you are, whatever you normally run. ARs, AKs, SKSs, Mosin Nagants, Glocks, High Points, Jennings, 1911s and their clones, Berettas and their clones. I'd also add to that common shotguns, some kind of break open, whether it's a single or a double. You can work one, you can work the other. Both a pump and a semi-auto tube-fed shotgun of whatever kind. for the manual of arms and understand how shotguns work. As for 22s are fairly common, but if you can, let's say the manual of arms on like a Ruger 10/22 and an AK-47 are very similar. And a Marlin Model 60, if you can run a tube-fed semi-auto shotgun, you can probably run a tube-fed semi-auto Marlin Model 60. But that'll pretty much round it out. And again, there might be some odd things you run into that I didn't list, but that's a big chunk of the common ones. That's probably going to cover the vast majority of things you're likely to run into. And again, there's the one-offs. But that's probably going to be the vast majority of it. So you should probably be familiar with how to run those weapons. Again, at a minimum, how to load, unload, manipulate the safety on the weapon if there is one, clear a malfunction, and be able to shoot it reasonably. Anyway, just something to think about threat weapons and familiarization with other weapons platforms. If you want to consider yourself a fighter, that's often something you'll do in the military. They call it fam fire. They'll lay out like some AKs and some, well, we get to play with like other cooler stuff that you probably don't, like machine guns and stuff like that. But you get the idea. It's a thing, and it maybe should be a thing for you. Again, not at first. At first, learn to run what you have. But after you've gotten some professional training and you're fairly competent with what you have, and you're comfortable with it, it's not a bad idea to look at threat weapons and common threat weapons and what you're likely to run into. With that, let's shift into the tactical tip of the day. You might be like, everybody knows this, but I didn't know it until recently, talking about somebody that may not know how to load a single action revolver. I didn't know there were fleece socks. You know, like the awesome fleece beanies you have in the military? I don't know why it never dawned on me to look for fleece socks. But recently I bought a pair. Probably my first pair, because I'll probably buy more because they're awesome, especially when it's crazy cold outside. Fleece socks is like a little fleece beanie for your feet. It's awesome. I didn't know about those. For cold weather, really nice. I also really, for a long time, and when I was guiding and things like that, I also really like alpaca wool socks. Those are really nice. But the fleece socks, they're really nice and comfortable and warm. I don't know if they'd be much good in like sneakers, but you probably shouldn't be wearing sneakers outside in cold weather anyway. For like my cowboy boots or my African Ranger boots, they're really nice. So anyway, fleece socks, they're a thing. With that, let's roll into the tactical verse of the day, hopefully the most important part. This plays into what we talked about today with threat weapons. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him, and cut off his head with it. This is talking about David. David cutting off Goliath with Goliath's own sword. David slew Goliath with his own weapon, which he was very familiar with. It says that he had slain lions and bear. And he went and picked out good ammunition for his EDC sling, projectile weapon. But after he knocked down Goliath, dead or not, I don't really know, but he went and cut off his head with Goliath's own sword. Threat weapon. Battlefield pickup. Right there from David and Goliath. I'll read it again in the, that was the NKJV. It's kind of my go-to, but I'll read it in the NIV. I know a lot of people like the NIV. David ran and stood over him, took hold of the Philistine's sword, drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. David, a man after God's own heart, and David was many things, but one thing he was a mighty warrior. Think about that. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.